Welcome to the 12th session of the Disaster Emergency Management Lecture Series organized by DEMN program at Royal Roads University. In this session, as you read the title about the session and the description about the session, we will learn about how cyber-physical interdependencies, organizational culture, governance gaps, and work pressures can intensify the impact of the insider-driven actions. Today, Dr. Bill Danielsen kindly and generously accepted to share his recent research findings plus a wealth of his previous experiences with us. In his lecture, he will introduce us to behavioral insights from insider threat research alongside the growing risk associated with aging critical infrastructure, mostly based on the lessons and experience in Canada. Before going any further in our session, like always, I would like to begin with the land acknowledgement. As most of you know, Royal Roads University acknowledges that the campus is located on the traditional lands of the Lukwigan-speaking people, the Swangi and Esquimalt nations. This land is a part of the fabric of the life of Indigenous communities, and it is with gratitude that we now learn and work here. That being said, I would like to invite all of you to take a moment and reflect on the land you are residing and acknowledging that colonialism is unfortunately not a historical context. It is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. Today, as I mentioned, I have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Bill Danielsen. Dr. Bill Danielsen is a senior executive leader with more than 29 years of experience across the federal government, defense, and international sectors. Bill has occupied roles as the Chief Information Officer for the Privy Council of Canada and the Prime Minister's Office, along with having been a Chief Security Officer and leading digital transformation in other major federal entities. In these capacities, he has overseen major modernization initiatives, advanced national cybersecurity and digital identity programs, and directed crisis management and continuity operations supporting profiles more than $200 billion. Now, for navigating complex, politically sensitive environment, he has led large, diverse teams and delivered high-impact transformation across Canada's public sector. Dr. Danielsen holds a Doctor of Business Administration and is recognized for his strategic leadership in security, technology, and emergency management. Thank you so much, Bill, for accepting this invitation. For those of you, this is the first time in participating in this the lecture sessions, I would like to let you know that the way that we are organizing is really the dynamic way of the discussion that we will have. We will continue with the presentation, with the lecture, and we will make sure to have enough time for exchange of the question and answer at the end of the presentation. Either you may prefer to write your questions or comments on the chat box, and I will make sure to read it loud at the end of the presentation, or you may prefer to keep the questions and unmute yourself at the end and ask your question directly to Mr. Danielsen. So without any further ado, I will invite Bill to start his lecture. And I personally am very keen and excited to listen to your presentation.
Thanks very much for that great introduction, and good day, everybody, and thanks so much for taking some time out of your day to sit in and listen on this lecture. I think it'll be interesting for a lot of folks because it provides a bit of a different lens on how we approach disaster and emergency management, and where we've typically looked at things from a standpoint of critical infrastructure and natural threats and combined and complex natural threats, and really taking it down to the human level and what that means from a threat risk management perspective. So without further ado, So when I talk about insider threats, what is it that I'm actually talking about? And so I want to have that kind of foundation as we kind of have that common piece. Let's move this off my screen. So insider threats, what we're talking about is people that are already in your organization. So individuals you've vetted, you've hired, you've trusted them, you've given them access, whether it's through physical means, your physical security protocols, or your IT infrastructure. So these are folks that you trust in your organization and you've given a degree of privileged access. The problem is there's oftentimes a case when they break that trust. And it's not always necessarily for personal gain. Sometimes it literally is just because, in the old adage, they want to see the world burn. Traits that have been identified as being linked to insider threats are things such as Machiavellianism, psychopathology, narcissism. The problem with these traits is that they're also present in our leaders. When you think of some of our political leaders, when you think of some of the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, they are narcissistic, they are Machiavelli. Just looked at that other side, they tend to make that fearless decision as opposed to being something that is seen as overtly manipulative or malevolent in nature. But it is really those behaviors and that tendency to be manipulative that is somewhat problematic. My doctoral research looked at how social bonds can mitigate this. And so in the sense of if you've got a connection to society, you've got a strong ethical underpinning, you've got that attachment and involved in your local communities, that these can actually offset the malevolent side of the dark tide. So what does this mean, though, from an emergency management perspective? Well, insider threats pose a non-traditional hazard to emergency management practice. Really, the traditional literature focuses on environmental hazards, and more recently, we're seeing the impact of compound disasters, and these are increasingly wild in the sense of what's happening, of drains on power grids that are happening on aging infrastructure, as an example. But I would suggest that there is a significant lack in preparedness and response to planning as it relates to insider threat risk for organizations that have control and domain over critical infrastructure. So where do these threats come from? A lot of the current infrastructure we look at is incredibly old, 1950s design, 1960 design. And it was at a time before there was IT infrastructure, before there was really significant security controls. So you have an aging infrastructure that has been left vulnerable to bolt-on technologies. So security as an afterthought as opposed to security by design, that's really hardening that infrastructure and making it more resilient. It's important that I note that insider threats can be both deliberate and non-deliberate. We think about your malware attacks and some credential stuffing campaigns and those things where the person inadvertently clicks on a link. Those are very, very real, and I want to acknowledge that. But for my part, where I really hone in and where I really focus is on a deliberate threat actor. And again, it's that person you've trusted, you've brought into your organization, and they abuse that trust to attack your system. As I go through the presentation, especially for folks that are practitioners in this space, I want you to think about critical infrastructure operations, your systems, and some of those pieces, and ask yourself the question, what would you do? You're in a crisis situation. What are you going to do if somebody actually puts a surge deliberately into a power grid? What would you do if somebody actually opened the flood dams on a dam and then broke the control interfaces? How would you respond to that? How have you prepared for that beforehand? If somebody takes corruption of databases and so then you cannot recover your systems, how are you going to try and respond? What mitigations are you going to put in place? So when you're doing your all hazards approach to your planning, how are you going to prepare? How are you going to train and test so that you can make your systems more resilient? All right, very, very important. And later on, the fun part, I'll go through some of the real world examples that have happened. So kind of a little bit in depth, what are we looking at in the sense of the challenge of pre-cyber era infrastructure? Our critical infrastructure systems like our power grids, our water networks, transportation, they're largely designed before cyber threats were even a consideration. Right? In the old days, I went on a kick lately of watching the old Alien films with my children. I'm not sure if you should really watch Alien with your children, but there it is. And seeing the computer screens and the old like blue, green, and everything else, those are legitimately still in place on half of our critical infrastructure. Not necessarily power related, but one of my previous roles had responsibility over the Social Insurance Registry, the largest database of personal information in Canada. Still brown screen data. written in COBOL on mainframes. So ancient interface, ancient technologies, that certainly is susceptible to various problems. These legacy systems, they lack segmentation, they lack proper encryption, they don't have real-time monitoring on them to any real significant degree, and this makes them highly susceptible to exploitation. A lot of the retrofitting that's been done on the digital controls and on the physical assets have actually created a problem. They've made a hybrid between kind of a cyber and physical environment that actually expands the attack surface, not taking away from it. So when you've got that trusted person, that IT administrator, or that angry employee that just knows the systems well enough, they, as an insider threat, are able to exploit these vulnerabilities, and they do so by leveraging their privileged access, manipulate the operational technology, and they disable the interlocks that introduce malware. I'll give one quick example just to kind of wet the taste buds early in the presentation. Ontario Power Generation, there was a disgruntled employee who decided to have one too many pops, went on YouTube and went at length to outline what system vulnerabilities for the principal nuclear reactors just outside of Oshawa. Was caught pretty quick. I wouldn't necessarily say the person has the traits for insider threat risk, but certainly somebody who made a bad decision, who was angry at their employer, who took action, and then on a public forum, because once you put on something on the internet, it never goes away, did damage willfully and deliberately to the organization by exploiting vulnerabilities. And so these are some of the risks we really need to unpack. So what is that cyber physical convergence that I'm talking about? Well, the convergence of the cyber and physical systems has amplified the complexity of risk management. Our modern infrastructures rely on digital connectivity for efficiency, but this interdependence creates systemic vulnerabilities. You know, it's funny when I think about most of the access control that happens in organizations right now. How do you do it? You don't use a key anymore. You have a pass card. What's that pass card controlled by? Well, it's controlled by an IT system. So you have an IT administrator who could literally unlock every single door in a facility with the punch of a button. What is the risk of that? What's the impact of that? Insider actions from one domain, such as IT, also propagate to the physical operations, again, like the pass code example, and this can cause cascading failures in an organization. An instance of this would be manipulating a network configuration in a water treatment facility that could halt chemical dosing. Imagine what would happen there. Somebody trips an imbalance to the chlorine input to your clean water, would make the Walkerton water problem in Ontario from 20 odd years ago look like a minor incident. Current disaster management frameworks highlight a lot of these interdependencies, but they look at them from a perspective of critical exposure points. There is some recent peer-reviewed studies, and I've got some of the references at the end of the presentation on the bottom here as well, that have looked at how aging infrastructure combined with digital overlays actually increases susceptibility to multi-sector disruptions. It's really important as emergency managers and professionals that we have to adopt that all-hazard lens that incorporates the cyber-physical dynamics. This will ensure that there's continuity plans that address that insider threat-driven scenario. And so that goes to my earlier point of kind of thinking about what are you doing from an organizational lens that can actually help you reduce that threat surface and that risk. Some of the strategies that can be employed look at cross-sector coordination, redundancy planning, bringing your business continuity plans to account for insider threat risk, and of course the ever important simulation exercise that model these different cascading impacts. So how about the disaster risk management integration? Well, when we apply disaster risk management principles to the insider threat, this would be involving analyzing your exposure, your vulnerabilities, your capacities. The exposure, of course, refers to the presence of critical assets, such as the emergency communication systems within each of the organizations. Your vulnerability is going to encompass looking at outdated infrastructure, weak governance controls, psychological stressors, and increased susceptibility to malicious attacks. Raise your hand if you don't see an increase in psychological pressure in your workplace. Ooh, everyone's either trying to figure it out now. Do I put my hand up for that? Do I not put my hand up for that? We know in society that we're under incredible amount of increasing pressures that grow monumentally every day. What are you doing? What is the organization doing to look at the impact of psychological pressure and that psychological slide on morale and cohesion in an organization. How does that actually increase or run the risk of increasing susceptibility to malicious or malevolent acts? When we talk about the capacity, of course, relates to the organization's ability to detect, prevent, and respond to these insider threat incidents. And this often lags behind the technical threat mitigation. This goes back to that the infrastructure was built in the 50s and 60s that did not have things such as active log monitoring or the use of AI to look at pattern analysis or to do active threat detection and defeat. Insider threats challenge the traditional DRM model because they originate internally. A lot of the stuff, again, is that external facing hazard. We don't look at the internal hazard and what it means to the organization. So it absolutely bypasses kind of the external threat models. Integrating insider risk into your all hazards planning is going to ensure a more comprehensive resilience. This would include embedding behavioral risk indicators into hazard assessments, conducting scenario-based training, and aligning mitigation strategies with your ethical processes and work, basically human resources practices, pardon me. Success in this program is going to lie in your dynamic capabilities, such as adaptive governance, AI-enabled monitoring, enhancing organizational capacity by framing insider threats within your DRM components, and making emergency managers develop holistic strategy that will address both human and technological dimensions of risk. Let's look at a couple of case studies. Back in the year 2021, the Colonial Pipeline underwent a ransomware attack. Now, not necessarily a direct insider, somebody who made the system vulnerable, but it did expose a weakness in critical infrastructure. Specifically, it shut down 45% of all fuel service and fuel availability to the eastern United States for a period of almost a week and a half that they had it locked down for. Where this links insider is they had weak governance, weak internal controls, and legacy IT systems that created that vulnerability. The attacker in this case used a credential stuffing, so they exploited a VPN, your virtual private networks, an old credential to gain access and manipulate the system and absolutely shut down the organization. Basically, you think about taking over an organization with one username and password. Wild to think of the impact. UK Post Office, they had a scandal that actually went on for 20 years. Insider threat, you had a leadership group that refused to acknowledge, so the narcissistic behavior, the Machiavelli tendencies to use it, refused to acknowledge gaps in the organization, the structure, had a massive impact on their ability to deliver social benefits through postal outlets, resulted in the conviction of more than 200 people that were not liable to this offense. So false accusations, false implication. There was mass suicides that resulted from this, from the blaming and all that, because of an absolute lack and failure of leadership to respond properly to the incident. And it was insider vulnerability related to software generation and coding and backdoors that led to that problem. There was also the cases, if folks are familiar with Jeffrey DeLille and Petty Officer St. Clair, two famous espionage cases from the Department of National Defense. In the case of Mr. DeLille, he was working for the National Defense Command Center, quite infamously walked up to the Russian embassy one day and decided to sell secrets to the Russians for a number of years. Petty Officer St. Clair was annoyed and frustrated at work and did a destruction of a database that harmed the relationship with NORAD, between NORAD and Canada. And so some very, very significant, and if anyone has questions on these, we can dig into them further as well. One of the important things is that analyzing these cases through an all-hazard lens reveals that there's common patterns. All right, there's an inadequate monitoring, weak governance structures, a failure to integrate behavioral indicators into risk assessments, and the lessons learned need to emphasize the need for proactive detection, cross-sector collaboration, resilience planning that accounts for the significance and the risk of insider threat. So effective mitigation of insider threat requires a layered approach combining technical, organizational, and behavioral strategies. One of the things I always push for is a priori. So before the attack, a lot of the protocols that are in place look at how do you respond once an incident has happened. You've had a flare-up, you've had an attack, you've had a storm that's caused damage. Okay, well, that's now done the damage. What have you done before that to actually reduce your threat surface, to reduce your risk? And so the importance of those kind of before event detection programs, in the case of my research, looking at psychosocial screening to identify high-risk individuals, high-risk behaviors before an event occurs. On a more tangible level, what can you do, even from an emergency management and disaster perspective, actually strengthen social bonds and cohesion within a workplace? It might seem kind of counterintuitive or outside of the lane of the responsibility of an EM professional, but what is the role in that where you can help build culture that actually looks to reduce risk for those malicious acts and reduce that threat surface? Additionally, of course, the importance of technical measures that include implementing things such as zero trust architectures, continuous monitoring and anomaly detections that's powered by artificial intelligence, or some of the other kind of top end solutions. I'll say, and it's not betraying any secrets, in the government of Canada, from a cyber threat perspective, we get about 6 billion attacks a day. I don't believe there is a human being or a team of human being alive that could actually process and defeat 6 billion attacks. So absolutely, artificial intelligence from a monitoring pattern and a threat reduction perspective is alive, well, and incredibly powerful. So insider threats represent a critical yet underappreciated dimension to disaster risk. The ability to exploit legacy infrastructure, trigger cascading failures, and undermine emergency response positions them as non-traditional hazards that require urgent attention. Integrating insider threat management into all hazards planning enhances an organization's ability to exercise greater resilience, and of course, this leads directly to improved societal safety. For folks that are looking at research in the space, I would suggest that the area for future research exploration would be advanced predictive models, ethical frameworks, behavioral screening, cross-sector strategies on that cyber physical security kind of footprint and what that means. For practitioners in the space, look at prioritizing governance reforms, workforce well-being, and how that might integrate into your EM plans, adaptive capabilities as all being keys to mitigating potential insider threat risks. By bridging the insights, pardon me, lost my spot. Yeah, I think really at the end of it, it's about emergency managers being able to build resilient systems that are capable of withstanding those external shocks, but also it's that key internal piece and that the insider threat risk. A couple of references, and I will take any questions.
Thank you so much, Will. Very interesting. That was really a new area for me. I wasn't so familiar with it, but it was very eye-opening and very informative. Thank you so much for that. Maybe you'd stop sharing your screen. That would be...
Yeah, that's my emails. I don't think you need to
Yeah, we are seeing your...
I hear that. Even the insider threat. It is a beautiful picture.
Insider threat, yeah.
Because I moved that bar, so I'm going to get rid of it. There we go.
Okay, perfect, amazing. So I personally have a couple of questions, but I believe that our audience also must have a couple of questions. They have to maybe a reflection or comments, but I always prefer to give a time to our the audience. If you have any question, please go ahead. We have plenty of time. Or comment, or maybe I start with my own personal questions. It's just a little bit of the curiosity. So we always have a debate when we're approaching to the technology, very advanced technology. Sometimes in the disaster emergency management, we consider technology as a potential threat. And from the beginning of your presentation, and the explaining the problematic, referring to those old-fashioned infrastructures, we usually intend to think that they could be safe. Those could be safe because they are not connected to the internet. They are really manual. There is the less risk of the, the manipulation from the outside. But as you mentioned, if there is a personnel with a very, bad intention, it could be also a risk. That's my first question, and I would like to know your approach, your point of the view, how this could be considered both as a risk and as the safety net, disconnecting infrastructures from the internet. I understand that your focus is internal threat, but at the same time, connecting to the internet could be that's an exposure to the external threat as well. And my next question is still in the same nature, but more specifically regarding AI. So right now, we are all in a certain uncertainty regarding the use of AI and the future of the AI, both as positive and pessimist, and the positive approaches to the AI. Some believe that the AI could be really lifesaver, game changer, and some believe that the AI could be a threat in the future. How do you think that being more reliable on AI or AI powered, the powered anomaly detection tools could be helpful to avoid such a kind of the threat in the future, insider threat, or not causing further threats in the future?
No, thanks very much for those. So, I mean, the strategy of, connectivity versus not, I think there's pros and cons to both. From an insider threat perspective, you don't get an advantage, right? If your system exists, it's vulnerable from that insider. If you go beyond that, you say, okay, well, from an overall infrastructure perspective, is it better for me to leave my systems not connected to the outside world? I suggest no, it's not. Because you're reducing the ability to have broader monitoring, broader control over your systems. If I've got a dedicated site and I've got staff at it, right, and I end up having a cascading failure, if there's no one there, I have a delay in time when I can actually intersect and try and defeat and try and do that. And so now I'm already down my kind of disaster continuum into having to try and go into recovery because the incident has happened. Technology can be used to actually see some of those threats, see some of those vulnerabilities or those impacts in a real-time basis, which actually speeds your response time, which then cuts down on that need for that recovery or reduces the risk on some of those recovery pieces. From an IT security perspective, there are ways to architect these systems so that they are not overly vulnerable, right? You think of just about everything we do every day is through some sort of IT medium or some sort of commerce. Your banking, your personal information, all of it's through IT systems, right? These video calls. It's about having security embedded by design as opposed to as an afterthought. And that's where the real risk and the problem comes, or people who act too hastily. All right, well, we need to be enabled, and then they just kind of don't think about security. One of the problems with security, especially in the IT space, is it does tend to be expensive. So in a time of budgetary constraints, people are like, well, I don't want that piece because that's too fancy. But you've got to have that risk balanced approach where you understand that, okay, I understand this is expensive. However, my cost, my reputational cost, my organizational cost, and the cost to society as a whole far outweighs, $100,000, $1 million. It depends on your infrastructure and your piece in place. So there certainly is a way to architect the IT for that connectivity in a way that's safe. And I would suggest that from a disaster and emergency management perspective, it's actually beneficial because it's going to give you those leading indicators that is going to improve your response time. It's going to reduce your impact on mitigation. From the AI piece, it's funny. I was saying this actually to my father-in-law just yesterday. Family's in from out of town. And I said, 5 years ago, the world was innovation, right? If you had anything that was work-related and you were going to have your performance review, hey, can you show me how you innovated? What do you mean? Let's just sprinkle some innovation on everything. And now it's AI. Hey, can we put some AI on that? Hey, we need more AI. Hey, do you know what it is? Yeah, we just need more of it. AI is really good and everyone's talking about AI, so let's have AI everywhere. Okay, cool. It's about smart AI. And so you do need human intervention. You need those human controls. There's things that the machine, right, the AI machine can do that we just can't. Or it's able to help create greater efficiencies for us, or improve mechanical workload and flow in a way that people just can't. A good
Mm.
example is that the adversaries are using AI to attack us. Well, I don't want a human response for that. I'm going to put the machine at the machine, right? And so I'm going to make the two machines fight it out because they can both work at hyper speeds and off they go. But I do need human intervention that when it finds that pattern, when it finds that piece, is there something in my system they're continually trying to exploit? Okay, I need to put that lens on that and sit back and go, okay, what's the so what to this piece? Now, how do I invent? How do I make changes to my process? How do I make changes to my infrastructure? How do I make changes to my layered defense, whether it's physical or cyberspace, that will make it so that the machine can't keep smashing at the door, right?
Mhm.
And so I think it's about the smart use of AI in inclusion as opposed to just let's sprinkle AI everywhere. There has to be that human intervention. There has to be that thought piece. But yes, use the machines to leverage all that work.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. Was a proof that how old-fashioned I am right now.
And I'm older than you, so remember, I'm really.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So I see that John here has already hands up. But so John, please unmute yourself. Go ahead with asking your question.
Yeah, hi Bill. Just in anecdotal conversations with friends, I've experienced a lot of that sensibility that narcissism and Machiavellianism concentrates in leadership. And it sounds like you spent some time thinking about it, and I was wondering if you had examples or any place where people have gotten traction to kind of fight that human nature we have of putting narcissists and psychopaths at the top leadership positions and having that apply and make improvements in the workplace if you've seen any case studies or how do we combat that? I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, there's a lot of literature on the space, both in organizational behavior and human resources journals and some of those pieces, John. It's one of these catch-22s, right? Because that narcissist is going to be personable. They're going to want to dig in. They're going to be that fun person. They're going to be engaged. They're going to be involved in those pieces. The Machiavelli side will have them, using the pieces of the puzzle to kind of move up the ladder. Uh, in the varying degrees, right? When you get to those more extreme ends, the literature's clear. They burn through teams, right? Because they're stepping on people's heads as opposed to trying to grow and nurture teams. So there's a lot of literature that identifies it. There's not much that's going to mitigate that. How does that, make anyone feel in the workplace? Be a psychopath if you want to get ahead. No, I think everyone possesses these things to varying degrees. It's about those extremes, right? I think if we've got corporate cultures where there's those stronger social bonds, you can have that person who's narcissist, the yay me person, and that propels them to want to advance, propels them. But the malevolent side, kind of the dark side of that piece, is offset by the fact that they love their colleagues, they love their work. They love the organization. They got a stable family, in some of those pieces. So it takes them from being kind of that Russell Williams, that colonel who, is raping and killing people and wearing children's undergarments, to being somebody who might be, less destructive. I was going to say a name, I will not because it would be career limiting. Think senior political figures. So not a great answer there, John, to say that, yes, the literature says it's there. Yes, it says a problem. No, nobody's doing anything about it.
Yeah, it sounds like I'm thinking about bowling and having the bumpers up in the aisles just like to mitigate some of the behavior. Like so there's uh, psychopaths are quite good at being likable, really, as you said. So keeping them within those bounds, and it just seems like a problem that could be addressed by outside consulting, maybe like how's your boss? What are we looking at here? And having that work systemically through the system, but it doesn't necessarily stop the next person coming up from the bottom. It's a sticky issue for sure. Thanks.
I know my doctoral research actually developed a screening tool that could be used, right, by organizations, much like when you apply to your Amazons of the world or those where they have you do a leadership inventory. I have created an inventory that you can actually use to screen for somebody who would be more on the malevolent side of risk. So they've got that dark triad, but they've got an absence of social bonds. So it's kind of a, not to say somebody will, right? Because that's not fair to say, but that there's an elevated risk that this person, if you give them the chance, would abuse their position.
The trade-off between leadership and attracting leadership talent and putting them underneath the specter of something of that kind of software. Do you think that's a conscious decision, or, like the tools exist, but they're not used, maybe?
I mean, I only just developed the tool last year.
Oh, okay.
And so we're,
yeah.
As happens in the doctoral journey, you're never done even once you finish that piece. So we're doing more peer-reviewed work and research and getting kind of uptake in the academic community, and then stand by to follow. Stand by for more. Me and my colleague may very well take this thing to market.
Okay, good speed. Yeah, thank you.
Great, wonderful, amazing. So we have a question here in chat from Sasha. Sasha, do you want to ask your question? Unmute yourself, or do you want me to read the question for you?
No, I could ask.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
All right. So Dr. Danielsen, just wondering if you're able to disclose any working examples of where an organization in Canada or perhaps elsewhere is integrating the workplace well-being into their EM plans. Seems interesting to me. Thank you.
Yeah, I've not read the literature in the sense of where people are doing active work in that space. I know anecdotally, there's a lot of work done on how do you improve corporate culture. The interesting thing in like today's day and age, right? Everyone's talking about the return to office, right? Very, very controversial space. But and I'll open myself up to barbs and wounds. Going back to the office is a good thing. People working in dispersed environments will not build cohesion in a team, will not build a corporate culture. And so you'll end up with people where there is an increased vulnerability, there's an increased risk. Long gone are the days of the 1960s where, the company believed in you, you believe in the company, and you're going to stay there forever, right? Like that's not a construct that exists anymore. But there's still an incredible value in how do you actually build those relationships? How do you build those teams where you trust and rely on each other, right? And that's those bonds, those relationships. As much as I've made great friends through teams and we've worked incredibly well, for the young professionals coming in, they will never get the chance to identify with a culture of an organization or to build that friend base, right? Anybody in the professional sphere, we say the most valuable thing you have is actually your Rolodex, right? Like your phone contact list, right? Really old Rolodex. Right, it's those people it's those relationships you build. In the emergency management space, back when I was a director of emergency crisis response, I used to say, I need to build my friends because in a crisis is not the time to make friends. When, part of my language, when shit pops off and I pick up the phone, I'm only answering calls from people I know. And people are only making my calls if I've got that relationship because there's too much going on in the space. I need that control. I need to build those relationships and have that culture already in place. So building that culture, doing that work within the workplace, having people in the office where they build those relationships is incredibly important. So long way, your question was, is anybody doing it? Yes, there's a lot of focus on workplace culture, workplace, bonding and development, but there's an equal amount of resistance by the workforce to actually participate in that.
Thank you. It seems to build a lot on our last course where we discussed social capital and all the different types of bonding capital. Thank you.
Yeah. Great that you found a connection between the two courses and in the practice. Okay, perfect. Amazing. So we have the next question. The next hands raised. Please unmute yourself, ask your question. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Danielsen. One of the things I'm looking at for my thesis is cross-sector intelligence sharing of data. And I'm wondering from an insider sort of threat lens where multiple agencies interpret and control data differently, or sort of that lens, if you have any sort of insights from what sort of I can take away from that, or what that might look like for like multiple organizations and like different approaches and where maybe weaknesses or what that might look like. I hadn't really thought of that until I listened to your lecture today, and I was like, oh, that might get a little complicated now.
Yeah, no, so much to unpack. So much to unpack. I mean, from an emergency management perspective, I was actually active on having some calls on this very, very recently. Communication, even within the federal government, at the secret level, across systems, the systems don't talk, even within one organization. So you have infrastructure challenges just based on the configuration and IT controls and how we can't actually get messages through our individual firewalls, right? And so we've got a gap, we've got a vulnerability that we have to actually try and attend to in that space. Then you've got the reputational risk side. Am I willing to share? Do I trust the person enough? Do I trust the organization enough? If I'm with the Department of National Defense, right, big intelligence infrastructure, and I'm doing disaster planning on food resiliency, am I really prepared to share with Agriculture Canada? Do I believe their security culture is enough that I can trust them with my information, right? That is a big piece. And again, it goes back to that, I guess, the previous course and that human capital and building those relationships. But part of it is also on that governance side. Do you have the governance in place? Do you have the controls to actually help facilitate that degree of trust? When the trust is abused, there's a number of like front page examples of where it caused global harm and had, you know, billion-dollar impacts to technology sharing, information sharing, and response in that space, because you have cases like DeLille, where you have an intelligence officer who betrayed his country. Well, how does the rest of the world then look at Canada? How are you vetting your people? What are you doing to respond to this? And it actually spurred Canada to develop an insider threat program after DeLille. It didn't exist beforehand. And so doing some of those pieces, and indeed Public Safety Canada has taken that and kind of moving it across the rest of government. So how does it relate? Very, very significantly from a technology perspective, from a trust, from a human capital perspective. There's a lot of really, really cool areas you can explore on that in your research.
Thank you.
I hope I didn't scare you, though.
Only a little bit. It's good.
Don't boil the ocean. Research 101. Don't try and boil the ocean.
That's very interesting because, you know, what you just mentioned, this exchange of the answer to the question, that was really very interesting perspective to add to one of our courses, which is facilitation, coordination, and decision making in multi-stakeholder environment. So we touch upon it, this concept, but also, you know, I think that it could be, you know, it could be then, you know, interesting to elaborate more on this you know, perspective on the course.
From a, you know, practitioner perspective, what is the most important thing in emergency and crisis response? Communication and coordination, right? Fundamentally, the most important things. What is the one thing that is always going to fail? Every single time. Communication. So when you have your most critical line faced with the reality that in every single after action report, every single incident, the number one item is communication. Where did we break down? So it's absolutely imperative, those two pieces.
So we have a course about that one as well, talking about the courses. So we have the communication crisis, but that one is unfortunately on the elective side of the course. It's not every student to choose that, but we have that option available for students who are interested in learning more about the importance of the communication in the crisis situation.
Yeah. Anybody who's unpacking that, do a search on the shooting at Parliament Hill in Canada. Law enforcement agencies between the RCMP, Parliamentary Protective Services, and Ottawa Police Service. There's the famous 10 codes, 10 for good buddy. All three of those entities use different 10 codes. A standardized code designed to be standard. They all use different variations of it. And so during a crisis event, they could not effectively understand each other.
Okay, perfect. That's amazing. So I wonder if the other students have a question, or I'm sorry, the audience, not the student, our audience, I have a question or a comment. Unless otherwise, I have a comment already in the chat. I would like to read it loud from Malcolm. He mentioned that at the beginning, so that very informative presentation. Thank you. Coming from the UK originally, it was interesting to hear the reference to the post office event. There is an interesting movie on that now from 2024 called Mr. Bats versus the Post Office, which tells the story of how this took place and the effect it had on the postmasters' businesses and livelihoods, many of whom could not handle the pressures associated from it and took their lives. Thanks again for your presentation today. That was a comment from Malk. Okay.
Yeah, links to John's comment, actually, and a question rather about, those leaders. And so it was an absolute failure of the leaders and the level of kind of Machiavelli tendencies and narcissism to refuse the problem and actually try and block, although the baseline problem was understood, and that grossly inhibited the ability to respond from a crisis perspective. And then again, those massive impacts to people's lives.
Certainly. I usually tend not asking too many questions during these lectures, but the topic is very close to my heart and I'm really excited about it. I permit myself to ask another question. So I wonder what is currently, the policy, that's federal government policy in that regard, how the government's reacting to these existing threats and what it's doing in terms of the policy development for mitigating or for managing this kind of the threats.
Yeah, so I can't get into some of the technology pieces. It's a bit on the sensitive side. But from a policy layer perspective, Public Safety Canada's produced the policy as it relates to insider threat risk and what are some of the indicators. CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, has built a training package and program on enabling folks to recognize insider threat risk in organizations and some of those pieces. And so the public safety document is publicly available. You can give that a Google and take a look at it. What the different departments are doing from an insider threat perspective varies quite widely. So it depends on your access and sensitivities to critical infrastructure, to certain piece of information. I mean, you have your security screening programs and you have your security clearances and renewals and how often they take a look at people, interviews. Depending on your organization, right, they do behavioral interviews, right, and psychometric testing, right down to lie detector tests, right, plugging people into the machines. So I'd say there's a robust program as it relates to insider threat, but it is not consistently applied. Even with a number of the advanced technologies that are employed to help reduce risk, a lot of them are still after the fact. And so we've got controls and mechanisms in place that reduce the ability of an insider to be wildly impactful. But a lot of times it's still as, okay, I've now been able to detect this happened, but it still has happened. Right. So that's, I think most organizations still have quite a ways to go when it comes to that space. And, from any classic, who's doing insider threat risk pieces, I don't think a year goes by that there isn't a major breach in the world. And I mean, on the corporate side, because there's so much information, so much money, commerce, that is handed out, through digital streams, the impact of kind of insider threat risk and those sorts of pieces is, can't be understated. It's a $200 billion a year industry to actually like hack systems and steal payments and do those pieces.
Thank you so much, Bill. I personally enjoyed your presentation. I believe that I share the audience also share the same feeling about your presentation. Thank you so much for the lecture. So as I mentioned from the beginning, this lecture has been recorded, and like always, the recording will be available on our website and plus our YouTube channel. Please feel free to reach out to Bill if you are interested in terms of the research, you are interested to continue exploring more in this topic. I already had a chat with Bill and he mentioned his interest in working and collaborating with the students in their thesis, in their the research and projects. And he already mentioned his excitement and interest. Thank you again. Please follow us and hopefully see you in our next webinar and next lectures session. Thank you all of you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.